Hey everybody, my name is Philip. Earlier this year I started a journey through God's Word, one chapter at a time. I wanted to see if I could pull out some real life lessons that we can use in our lives today. So whether you have read the Bible for years or you're new to God's Word, my intention is to break down each chapter as simply and as clearly as I possibly can and try to leave us with some takeaways that we can use in our life. So I hope these videos are beneficial to you in some way, and I hope you enjoy them. Welcome back. Here we are again for the conclusion of the book of 2 Kings. Now today's video might be a little bit longer. I'm very sorry. I'm going to be as quick as I can, but this is going to cover chapters 24 and 25, the final two books in the book of 2 Kings. The final two chapters, rather, of the book of 2 Kings. Let me get my summary pants on and summarize this for you as best I possibly can. Alright, so just a quick recap of what got us to this point. We've seen good kings, we've seen bad kings, we've seen how God has used both good kings and bad kings for his greater purpose. We've seen the people of Israel and Judah led astray by evil and wicked kings. We've seen the people of Judah come back to an understanding and a knowledge of God through good kings. So, believe it or not, the book of Kings tells a story of a lot of different kings. Who'd have thunk it? Alright, chapter 24, we're starting off. For generations, prophets had warned the kings and the people to turn from their evil ways, but now judgment was at their gates. It was no longer a distant threat. So at the beginning of chapter 24, we see please let me say this right. We see King Jehoiakim, and in these days, we see a storm begin to kind of gather. Babylon under the mighty King Nebuchadnezzar, that may be a name you've heard before, but Babylon rose as a superpower of this age. In chapter 24, verse 1 says, during Jehoiakim's reign, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon invaded the land of Judah. Jehoiakim surrendered and paid him tribute for 3 years, but then rebelled. So King Jehoiakim rebelled, and Babylon responded with relentless force. They sent raiders from every direction, from the Chaldeans, the Syrians, the Moabites, the Ammonites, all whom were allowed by God himself. We see that in verse 3 because it says, "These disasters happened to Judah because of the Lord's command." So King Jehoiakim, he dies. His son Jehoiachin dies. Jehoiachin takes over. He's only 18 years old. He takes the throne. But he resigns just 3 short months after taking the throne because of surrendering to Babylon when they besieged Jerusalem. Man, there's a lot of big words here. I hope you'll bear with me. This is starting to twist my tongue. So Babylon comes, they besiege Jerusalem, and Jehoiachin surrenders. Now he, along with the other officials, even his mother and the other elite of the city, were carried away in chains to Babylon. We see that in verse 14. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar took all of Jerusalem captive, including all the commanders, the best of the soldiers, the craftsmen, the artisans, 10,000 in all. Only the poorest people were left in the land. So King Nebuchadnezzar, he basically raids the temple, he plunders the temple. Solomon's golden articles were broken into pieces. And Babylon installs a fellow named Zedekiah. Zedekiah was the uncle of Jehoiachin, and they install him basically as a puppet king. But verse 19 in chapter 24 tells us he did what was evil in the Lord's sight, just as Jehoiakim had done. But in the very last verse of chapter 24, we see even that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon as well. So King Nebuchadnezzar once again besieges the city of Jerusalem under Zedekiah's reign, and this siege lasts for about 2 years. So while this siege was going on, famine starts to take hold. People were not getting food that they needed because of this siege. There was no bread. The people were starting to get desperate. In chapter 25, verse 3, it says, By July 18th, in the 11th year of Zedekiah's reign, the famine in the city had become so severe, and the last of the food was entirely gone. Then the walls of Jerusalem were breached. Zedekiah and his men fled into the night, but were captured in the plains of Jericho. And when they catch Zedekiah, Nebuchadnezzar does something gruesome. Verse 7, it shows us that they made Zedekiah watch as they slaughtered his sons in front of him. Then they gouged out Zedekiah's eyes, they bound him in bronze chains, and they led him away to Babylon. So the Babylonians then destroy everything. They burn the temple of the Lord. They burn the king's palace. They burn all the houses in Jerusalem. Only a small remnant remained under a fellow named Gedaliah. He was a governor appointed by Babylon. But this small remnant was, in verse 12, says, some of the poorest people that were left behind to care for the vineyards and the fields. But even this Gedaliah fellow gets assassinated by a member of the royal family, Ishmael. And fear was spreading. The people fled to Egypt. They're afraid of Babylon's revenge. Yet at the end of 2 Kings, there's the faintest flicker of hope because Jehoiachin, the exiled king, was released from prison by Nebuchadnezzar's successor, a fellow by the name of Evil Merodach. Evil Merodach. But it says in verse 28 that he spoke kindly to Jehoiachin and gave him a higher place than all the other exiled kings in Babylon. So Jehoiachin, at the end of this chapter, end of this book, he's given royal clothes, he's given a place at the king's table for the rest of his life. And in verse 30 it says he even gave him a regular food allowance as long as he lived. And that concludes the book of 2 Kings. So we've come to the conclusion of the book of 2 Kings, and it's not a happy ending. It's a national tragedy, really. But what lessons can we pull from these two chapters today? I think that number one, judgment is real. I think sometimes we can mistake God's patience for a lack of justice. But God had warned these people for generations. God had been patient with them. But eventually, the judgment does come. Why? Because sin always has consequences. We may not see the results or the consequences of our sin right away, but we need to recognize that those consequences, although delayed, will come. Justice will come. I think we live in a culture that we really like the God of love, but we don't really talk or like the God of justice. But God doesn't look away forever, and I think 2 Kings does a good job of capturing that characteristic of God, that he's a just God. And whether we're talking about individual sins or the sins of an entire nation, unrepented sin brings destruction. Now, it sounds scary, but I don't think the intention is to scare you. The intention is not to scare me. The intention is not to scare us. I think it's there to wake us up. So we need to ask ourselves, am I willing to take correction? Am I brushing off what God is trying to correct in me? Or am I telling myself, no, I've got this figured out. I don't need correction in that. It's super easy to do, but I think we really need to be open-minded about saying, God, call out the sin in my life, call out the things that I need to be corrected in, and God, let me be responsive to those corrections. What else? The people of Jerusalem lost everything. They burned down the house of the Lord. They burned down the homes. They burned down the palace. They destroyed everything. The idea here is that you can literally lose everything, but you can't lose the presence of God. These people lost their king, their identity, their land, everything about them was gone, but they didn't lose God. The Lord went with them into exile. Now, he wasn't confined to a building or chains, but the people were definitely not alone in exile. So for us, when our plans fall apart, when our jobs fall apart, marriages, our health starts to collapse, we need to recognize that God has not left us. We might feel in a lot of ways like we're in exile, but God is always near to the brokenhearted. God is always near to us. So the real challenging question is, are we clinging to God in those situations, or are we clinging to comfort? Are we clinging to our comfort zone? Sometimes when we get out of our comfort zone and things feel very uncomfortable, our human nature wants to say that God must be absent, but it's not true. Oh yeah. At the end of this book, starting in verse 27, taking you to the end of chapter 25, I thought it was really cool. This passage in my Bible is labeled Hope for Israel's Royal Line. So after all this destruction, after all this heartache, after the people are sent into exile, the idea that Jehoiachin The exiled king who was shamed, who was living in chains, was lifted up, and he was given royal garments. He was given a seat at the king's table. I just find this interesting because I think it's a really cool picture of the gospel, of the good news of Jesus, that even in exile, when we don't deserve it, God makes room for us. He's offering us grace when we've run out of second chances. And if you're anything like me, you mess up all the time. I know I do. I mess up all the time, and I start to kind of have this feeling of like, man, I thought I had dealt with this. I thought I had already worked through this. God, give me another chance. God, give me another chance. God, give me another chance. And it just feels like after so many times of saying that, that you start to kind of think, God, how could you possibly keep forgiving me? But I believe God's offering us grace when we have run out of those second chances. So my question for you is, have you received God's grace, or are you still sitting in your self-imposed exile? All you have to do is call on the name of the Lord and you will be saved. Don't say I've messed up too badly or gone too far for God to reach out and save me. God will offer you grace, and He has more forgiveness than we have sin. All right, here's what I want you to keep in mind as you think about the book of 2 Kings. Number one, that God takes sin seriously, and we should as well. When we have sin in our lives, whether we are convicted of that ourselves, whether someone calls it out in us, we should take it seriously. Don't try to rationalize, don't try to justify it. God takes sin seriously, so we should too. The other thing is that God is with us in the exile, so His presence is with us regardless of where we're at in our lives, in our spiritual walk. God's presence is with us, and He's only a phone call away. You just have to call out and say, God, I need you, forgive me, and He will. And finally, God's grace makes beauty from the ashes. Our story doesn't have to end in ruin. Our story won't end in ruins if we're simply calling on God, we're repenting, we're saying, God, I've messed up, I need your grace. He will offer it readily. You're going to go through seasons of life where you feel like your world is burning down, your walls are falling in, and your hope is thin. But just remember that the God that was with the people in Babylon in their exile is with you today. And don't ever feel like your past disqualifies you from receiving the kindness of our King. Won't He do it?